Pronunciation is usually limited to the first few weeks of a Chinese course, which is a pity because clear pronunciation is important whether you've studied Chinese for a week or a decade. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about pronunciation, and that maybe shouldn't come as a surprise to people who have listened to a few episodes or who follows Hacking Chinese in general, because I am very interested in pronunciation and it is something that I think is quite important. So like I said in the introduction, it's a pity that this is often something you do in the first few weeks of class and then never again, or at least it's not in focus after that. And of course, most people will not learn clear and easy to understand Mandarin in just a few weeks or even a few months. It takes much longer than that for most people and you need to really practice it. Because unlike learning your first language, learning a second language takes much longer and it's not something where you can expect to reach a certain level just by keeping going in the same direction. Most people stagnate at some point, they maybe don't care that much about pronunciation and so on. So in today's episode, I want to talk about a few reasons why pronunciation matters and maybe why it matters more than you think. And the reason I do it today and not any other day is that I'm opening my pronunciation course for registration, and this will be on Tuesday, January 11th, and the course will stay open for registration until January 18th. If you want to learn more about the course, including if you're listening to this after the 18th, you can head over to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com and there will be plenty of information about the course. And if it's not open, it will also give you an opportunity to leave your email address so I can notify you when the course opens again. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about why pronunciation matters. And the first reason is, of course, that pronunciation does influence communication. It's of course not the only thing that influences communication, but it does certainly influence it. If your pronunciation is really bad, it's going to be extremely hard to understand what you say, unless it is very predictable given context. This is something we talked about in episode 45, where I argued that the predictability of your utterance influences how important pronunciation is, meaning essentially that if the person can guess what you're going to say, regardless of how you say it, it's not going to be very important. But in cases where they really can't guess what you're trying to say, pronunciation becomes very important. Now, it should be obvious that you need the basics of pronunciation to even speak the language, that goes without saying. Like, for example, if you read everything in Chinese, let's say you treat pinyin as if it were English, you are going to have some major problems with your pronunciation, and it should be obvious that this will influence how much native speakers understand of what you're saying. Which is why we talked about this in episode 11, which is all about why you shouldn't use English to think of how Chinese initials and finals are pronounced. At this point, I think some people think that, okay, I have the basics of pronunciation down, I just care about communication and want to be able to talk to people, so there is no real reason to go further with my pronunciation. I think this attitude is built on a misunderstanding, namely that pronunciation doesn't really influence communication beyond the basics. But this is not true. How easy or difficult you are to understand in Chinese is of course dependent on other things than pronunciation. For example, the words you use, the way you put them together and so on, your body language and all sorts of other communicative skills are very important, and pronunciation is one of these. And of course, if you have perfect grammar, you choose the right words and all that, well, if you have a single pronunciation mistake in a sentence, it's usually not going to matter that much, especially if it's somewhat clear what you're talking about given context. But the truth is that almost all foreigners who speak Chinese have lots of issues in all these areas. We don't use exactly the right words, our grammar is a little bit messed up sometimes, and then if you also add pronunciation mistakes to this, the result will be that people have to struggle to understand what you say, and even if they do understand, it means that it's effortful for them, and they might not want it to be effortful or think that it's tiring to talk to you, but that's the way it is. It simply is harder when you have to really try to understand what someone says. Also, tones and pronunciation in general do matter at a more advanced level too. For example, I've studied Chinese for 14 years now, and I also make mistakes occasionally, including with pronunciation, and it fascinates me how easily just a single mistake in a sentence can throw somebody off. we're having a discussion about something and I say something, the sentence is correct, the grammar is correct, the words are right, but I'm messing up the tones on one single key word and the other person is completely blank and has no idea what I'm trying to say. And you'd think that if you write this down and you look at it, it should be fairly easy to guess what this word is, even if one tone is wrong. But in practice, I've noticed that this does happen. And of course, this is not something limited to me. It happens to everybody. It's just that I feel that this is sometimes still a bit perplexing. Like, okay, there was one mistake in this sentence and you didn't understand what I was trying to say. And of course, it's not their fault. This is communication after all, so it takes two and so on and so forth. But I think as language learners, it's important to know that even small mistakes actually can throw people off, even if you have reached a fairly advanced level of Mandarin. So the important thing here is to have clear pronunciation. And for me, clear pronunciation means that native speakers don't have to think so much and don't need to struggle to figure out what sound you say. Well, naturally, they don't think about this in terms of sounds, but what I'm saying is that it should be easy for them to identify the words and do so rather effortlessly. This doesn't mean that your pronunciation has to be native-like, so that somebody thinks that you're a native speaker, or that you have to speak perfectly standardized Mandarin or something like that. It just means that you should focus on mistakes that make people confuse one syllable for another, or one word for another. So for example, some students struggle with the initials J and ZH, which can sound pretty similar. This is not usually a problem because the final that comes after is different in all cases. So for example, if we take a syllable like jia, that would be J-I-A, as in home, for example, and zha, that's Z-H-A, which can mean stab or prick, for example, we can see that the finals are different. In jia, we have I-A, and in zha, we have just an A. Now, if you start messing up the original sound here, or let's say that you say exactly the same sound for the initial in both these cases, so you kind of merge J and ZH. This is not really a problem for communication, provided that you stick to the correct finals. So you have the A in zha, and then you have the ya in jia. Then people will be able to figure out what you're saying. So that would be a problem that is not very problematic usually, whereas if you mispronounce the final here, people will misunderstand what you say and they will interpret one syllable as another, and that is a problem. So the goal for most students, at least to begin with, should be to reach this level of clear pronunciation where people find it easy to understand, although you might still have some small oddities that give you away as a non-native speaker. That is okay. If you are really interested in pronunciation or really care about it, of course you can continue and try to develop it even further towards native-like pronunciation, but I think that's really something that you only do if you're interested in it. As long as your pronunciation makes it easy for people to understand what you're saying, I think that's fine. And that is certainly more than you get in most Chinese courses. Okay, let's move on to reason number 2, and that is that pronunciation is a representation of you and your Chinese ability in general. There are, of course, many ways you can be good at a language. Maybe it's listening, speaking, reading, or writing, or maybe it's related to Chinese characters or literature or something else. But the most obvious one is speaking, because it's something that people can hear instantly, and when you interact with people in real life, that is usually the medium you use. And pronunciation here matters because it's the most obvious part of pronunciation. If you say something, people will have an opinion about your Chinese ability after just one sentence, based on your pronunciation, what you're saying, and so on. This is not very fair, of course. You might be very good at Tang poetry, for example, or say you're an expert at Chinese characters, but if you can't talk about these things in a way that makes sense to people, and if your pronunciation is that of a beginner, they simply might not take you as seriously as they should. And like I said, this is unfair. We teach people that they shouldn't judge a book by its covers all the time, and yet people do this subconsciously and automatically. It's not something they want to do, but it still happens. And pronunciation is something very obvious. It strikes you in the face, well, in the ears in this case, and it's something that is very hard to not notice, and people use this to judge all sorts of things they shouldn't do. If you think about it, the other skills are not like this, because if you think of, say, reading or listening, those are very hard to prove or to show that you're good at. I mean, you almost need a proficiency test to really know how good someone is to, say, read in Chinese, or how good they are at listening. Although, of course, you could do that in a conversation by asking follow-up questions, by checking their comprehension and so on. But in a normal conversation, most people don't do that. And just with basic listening ability, you can get your way through a conversation by saying, 对, 是的, or and people might not actually know how much you understood of what was going on. And the same goes for reading. I mean, they can see you read a book, or I can tell you that I've read 100 books in Chinese and so on. But what does that matter if when you talk about them, people don't get the feeling that you actually know this? It's not something that they really can feel. And hence, my theory is that as a stand-in for all this, we just rely on the things we can see and feel, and that is usually pronunciation and speaking ability. And of course, if it's in writing, we could also say maybe the same thing for writing and maybe handwriting as well, although I think that is less relevant today. This is also something worth reflecting on when it comes to language ability in general, and this is slightly out of scope for this episode where we're talking about pronunciation, but I still want to mention it. It's easy to associate language ability with competence, intelligence, or things like that in general. So for example, if you have an immigrant in a country who doesn't speak the language very well, they might be very intelligent, they maybe have a PhD in physics or something else in their home country, but if they cannot speak the language, they will automatically be judged because of this. And we all know that this is very unfair, but it's still something that is hard to get around if you don't have a proper way of communication. This does apply to you as well if you really care about what other people think about you, and this is not, as I said, just limited to your language ability. But let's say you are in a job interview or you really want to impress someone socially or something like that. That is pretty hard to do if you are, say, very good at reading but very bad at pronunciation. It's much easier to do the other way around, so if you're very good at pronunciation but not so good at reading, that's not something that's going to get found out very easily in a conversation. Whereas bad pronunciation is immediately obvious to everybody who listens. And like I said, this is regrettable. In the best of worlds, people wouldn't judge books by their covers, but people still do, and this is something we should take into account when we say that pronunciation isn't very important, when in fact it is. Beyond the things that I have covered so far, I think there are a couple of things that are worth mentioning as well. The first of those is that good pronunciation can also help you win the language struggle. And if you don't know what that means, it simply refers to the struggle between native speakers of Chinese and native speakers of other languages when we meet and try to practice Chinese. They want to practice English with you, you want to practice Chinese with them, or some other setup depending on where you live. And I think that good pronunciation largely avoids this problem. If your pronunciation is good, people will more readily speak Chinese with you and they will feel more comfortable doing so. And like I argued earlier, they might also overestimate your other abilities, which is good. It makes them more comfortable talking with you. Although it could also mean that they speak much faster, use more advanced grammar and so on than they would if you think you really are a beginner. And this is something that happens all the time. It's almost like you have a binary judgment, like they think that either you are a complete beginner who doesn't know anything, or they think you're a native speaker. So if your pronunciation is good and you just say ni hao, or you say some basic phrases and you say them well, they will then assume that you're a native speaker and just speak very fast about advanced topics and you will not understand anything. So just be prepared to ask people to repeat themselves a little bit more often if your pronunciation is good. But that is a very low price to pay. The other extra thing I want to mention is that improving your pronunciation could also help your listening ability. And this is something I mean to investigate a little bit further, and I will probably write an article and record a podcast episode about this in the future. But for now, it's just worth noting that spending time with pronunciation can make it easier to understand what other people say. And this is a little bit complicated because, of course, attention is very important when learning languages. So it could be that when you practice pronunciation and learn how things are supposed to be said, you will then also listen for these things when you listen to other people and therefore also find them easier to understand. However, it's a little bit tricky to sort out what factors influence what here, because of course listening also influences pronunciation, and I would say that the foundation of good pronunciation is to have strong mental models of how these sounds are supposed to sound in Chinese, and the only way we're going to get that is to listen and listen a lot. Still, there are some studies that look at the impact of pronunciation practice on listening, and this is something, like I said, that I will try to get back to in a future episode. That's it for this episode, and I hope that I have been able to convince at least some of you that pronunciation is a little bit more important than you thought it was before. And if you are interested in improving your pronunciation to be able to communicate more clearly, don't forget to check out Hacking Chinese Pronunciation Speaking with Confidence. And you can do so by going to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.